The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my driveway that Saturday evening was not what was there. It was what was missing. My porch light was gone. Not broken, not burned out, not hanging loose by a wire. Completely gone. And in its place was a small black security camera staring straight at my driveway like someone had decided my own front porch was now part of their property. I wish I could say I was shocked because strange things never happened in my neighborhood. But the truth is, I had already learned that some people will cross a line the moment they convince themselves they're doing it for a good reason. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for nearly 8 years I lived in a quiet little neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a brick ranch house built back in the 1960s. It was not the biggest house on the street, and it definitely was not the newest, but it was mine. I spent years fixing that place up one room at a time, replacing old pipes, restoring the original hardwood floors, rebuilding the backyard deck with my own hands. Every corner of that house had a memory attached to it. The porch light was one of those small things most people would never notice, but I noticed it every single night. It was an old-fashioned bronze fixture I installed the first month after I moved in. After a long day at work, pulling into the driveway and seeing that warm yellow glow waiting at the front door gave me this simple feeling that I was finally home. It sounds silly, I know. It was just a light. But sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest meaning. 2 years after I finished the renovation, a new neighbor moved into the house next door. His name was Colin Boss, and within about 10 minutes of meeting him, I knew he was the kind of person who never entered a room without trying to become the person in charge of it. Colin introduced himself as a home security specialist. He ran a small company installing surveillance systems for businesses around the county, and he had a habit of turning every conversation into a sales pitch. He wore expensive sunglasses even when standing in the shade and spoke with the confidence of someone who believed everyone else was just waiting for his advice. The first real conversation we had happened while I was trimming the bushes along the property line. Colin leaned over the fence and looked at my porch light like he was inspecting a problem. "You know, you could really upgrade that setup," he said. "Smart lighting, motion sensors, integrated cameras. Stuff like this is basically from another era." I smiled and told him I actually liked it that way. I liked simple things. I liked knowing that when I flipped a switch, a light came on. No apps, no passwords, no company collecting data about my own house. Colin laughed quietly, but there was something uncomfortable about it. "People who refuse to adapt usually end up behind everyone else," he said. I remember looking at him for a second because it did not sound like a joke. It sounded like a warning. I ignored it. Maybe I should not have. A week later, I left town for a short weekend trip to visit my sister. Nothing exciting, just a quiet couple of days away. When I came back Sunday afternoon, I carried my bag up the walkway, expecting the usual sight of my home waiting for me. Instead, I stopped halfway to the door. Something felt wrong. The porch looked different. Then I saw it. The bronze light fixture I had installed years earlier was gone. In its place was a black dome camera mounted directly over my front entrance. The wiring was neat. Almost professional. Too neat, actually. A cable disappeared along the side of my house and crossed over toward Colin's property. For a moment, I just stood there trying to process what I was seeing. I checked the front door. Locked. Nothing stolen. Nothing damaged except the one thing someone had intentionally removed. I walked closer and looked at the camera lens pointing toward my driveway, my walkway, and a good portion of my front yard. My stomach dropped. This was not a misunderstanding. This was someone making a decision about my home without asking me. I knocked on Colin's door, and after a few seconds, he opened it halfway. He looked at me, then at the camera, and somehow he already knew why I was there. "Oh, that," he said with a small smile. "You're welcome. It's part of a neighborhood safety upgrade." I stared at him. "You removed my porch light and installed your camera on my house?" He shrugged like I was complaining about a package being delivered late. "It's temporary. The angle was better from there. It helps everyone. Your driveway is covered. Your entrance is covered. And I manage the feed." That last sentence was the one that stayed with me. I managed the feed, not we. Not the neighborhood. Him. I told him he needed to remove it immediately. Colin leaned against the doorframe and smiled. "Daniel, don't make this bigger than it is. This is progress. Nobody cares about a little camera, except people who have something to hide." That sentence bothered me more than the camera itself, because I knew exactly what he was doing. He was turning my objection into a character flaw. If I wanted privacy, somehow I was the problem. I did not argue with him. I did not yell. I simply went back to my house, grabbed my phone, and started taking pictures. The camera, the wiring, the mounting holes, the serial number, every detail. Something told me this was no longer a neighbor disagreement. It was something that needed to be handled carefully. And as I stood there documenting the device that had replaced my porch light, I had no idea that one small camera would eventually expose a much bigger problem hiding behind Colin's idea of community safety. The next morning, I woke up expecting to feel angry, but what surprised me was that I mostly felt disappointed. Anger is easy. Anger burns hot and disappears quickly. Disappointment stays with you because it makes you question people. I kept thinking about that conversation with Colin, about how casually he had walked onto my property, changed something that belonged to me, and then somehow made me feel like I was the unreasonable one for objecting. I've lived long enough to know that most conflicts do not start with someone admitting they are wrong. They start with someone believing they are entitled. So instead of knocking on his door again, instead of giving him another chance to turn it into an argument, I decided I was going to find out exactly what he had done. I called a licensed electrician named Mike Holloway, a guy recommended by a friend who had worked on older homes in the area. When he arrived, he walked around the porch for almost 5 minutes without saying much. He looked at the camera, looked at the wiring, looked back at the camera, and then finally looked at me. "Did you approve this?" he asked. I told him no. "Did you hire anyone to modify the fixture?" Again, no. He sighed and shook his head. "Well, whoever did this knew what they were doing physically. But that does not mean they had permission to do it." He inspected the junction box where my old porch light had been connected. Then he followed the cable running along the side of the house. His expression changed when he saw it crossing the property boundary. "This is a problem," he said. "You cannot just run someone else's electrical equipment through private property because you think it is a good idea." That was the first moment I realized this was bigger than a rude neighbor. Colin was not just being inconsiderate. He had created an installation that involved my home, my electricity, and my property without my approval. Mike recommended that I contact the city's code compliance office, so I did. A few days later, an inspector named Rebecca Sloan came out to take a look. She was calm, professional, and the kind of person who had clearly seen every strange neighborhood dispute imaginable. She walked around with a clipboard, taking notes. At first, she did not say much. Then she saw the cable crossing the boundary line and stopped. She looked at me and asked, "Who installed this?" I told her my neighbor had done it. She looked back at the camera and quietly said, "You need to document everything. Do not touch it. Do not disconnect it. Leave it exactly as it is." There was something about her tone that made me realize this had crossed from annoying into serious. I followed her advice. I kept every photo, every message, every note. And for the first time since discovering the camera, I felt like I was no longer standing alone. Of course, Colin was not going to simply accept that someone had questioned him. 3 days after the inspection, I found an envelope pushed under my front door. It was from an attorney's office. Inside was a letter explaining that the camera was only a temporary security test installation designed to improve neighborhood safety. It said Colin believed the device benefited everyone, and that removing it without cooperation would be unfortunate. Then came the part that almost made me laugh. He offered to provide me with a copy of the footage for full transparency. The same footage from the camera he installed without asking me. The same footage from a device he controlled. And then, as if that was not enough, the letter suggested that I pay half the cost if I wanted the camera professionally removed. I read that paragraph 3 times because I honestly thought I had misunderstood it. This man had replaced my property, created the problem, and now wanted me to help pay to fix it. It was such a perfect example of confidence without accountability that I almost respected the creativity of it. Almost. But I knew better than to respond emotionally. I forwarded everything to the city inspector and waited. About a week later, Rebecca called me. "Mr. Mercer, we completed our review," she said. "Your neighbor has been issued a compliance notice." I asked what that meant. She explained that the city had found several violations connected to the installation. The electrical work had not been permitted. The modification involved private property without authorization. The placement of the camera created privacy and property concerns because it was installed on my structure and directed toward areas under my control. Colin was ordered to remove the equipment, repair the damage, and restore the original fixture within 14 days. When I hung up the phone, I sat there for a while just staring at the wall. Not because I was celebrating. Honestly, I was tired. People sometimes imagine these situations like a movie where the good person wins and everyone cheers. But real life is different. Real life is spending evenings collecting paperwork, taking photos, making calls, and wondering why a simple conversation with a neighbor became something that required official intervention. But there was one thing I did feel: relief. Because the entire time Colin had acted like rules were something that applied to everyone except him. Now, for the first time, he had to answer to someone who did not care about his confidence, his business cards, or his speeches about progress. The deadline arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. I stood on my porch and watched as a licensed contractor arrived with the city inspector. Colin came outside almost immediately. He looked different than he had before. No sunglasses, no relaxed smile, no lecture about technology. Just a man watching someone else undo a decision he thought nobody could challenge. The contractor carefully removed the camera, disconnected the unauthorized wiring, repaired the mounting area, and brought out a replacement for my old bronze fixture. As the light was installed, Rebecca recorded the process for the city's records. Colin stood in his driveway with his arms crossed. Finally, he called out, "This is ridiculous. I was trying to help people." Rebecca looked over and calmly replied, "Helping people does not give you permission to modify their property." For once, Colin had nothing to say. But just when I thought the story was over, I noticed something strange during the removal. Behind the camera housing was another cable connection, one I had never seen before, running toward a small box hidden near the side of his garage. And that discovery made me realize the camera on my porch might not have been the only thing Colin had installed without permission, because sometimes the first violation is not the biggest one. It is just the one that finally gets someone caught. I thought removing that camera would be the end of the story, but looking back now, I realized that was only the moment when the truth started coming out. Because when someone gets used to having control, losing a little bit of it can make them reveal a lot more about who they really are. For the next few days after the city contractor restored my porch light, things around the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. Colin stopped making his usual comments when he saw me outside. No more lectures about smart homes. No more jokes about people who were stuck in the past. He would just look over, give a quick nod, and walk back inside. Part of me wanted to believe that maybe he finally understood. Maybe having someone from the city explain basic boundaries had finally made him realize that good intentions do not excuse bad decisions. But deep down, I knew people like Colin rarely change because someone tells them they are wrong. They usually just change their strategy. A few weeks later, I was watering the plants near my driveway when my neighbor Linda from across the street walked over. She was one of those people who noticed everything but rarely said anything unless it mattered. She looked at my restored porch light and smiled. "You know, Daniel, I always wondered why that light disappeared," she said. I told her the story, and she shook her head. Then she lowered her voice and said something that caught my attention. "You're not the first person he's tried that with." I asked what she meant. She explained that Colin had been encouraging other neighbors to install his security devices, sometimes offering discounts and sometimes suggesting that everyone needed to standardize their homes for safety. At first, people thought he was just being helpful, but over time, some residents started feeling uncomfortable because his idea of neighborhood security always seemed to involve him being the person in control. He wanted every camera angle, every connection, every piece of information to run through his system. And suddenly the camera on my porch looked different to me. Before, I thought it was an isolated act of arrogance. Now I realized it was part of a pattern. Colin was not just installing cameras. He was building influence. He was creating a little network where he became the person everyone depended on. And maybe that was the real reason he got so angry when I refused. It was not because he wanted to protect my house. It was because he could not understand why someone would reject his authority. A few days later, Rebecca from the city contacted me again. She told me that during the removal process, the inspectors had noticed additional wiring connected to Colin's security equipment. They had opened a separate review because some of the installations appeared to involve shared utility spaces in areas close to property boundaries. She did not give me every detail, and honestly, I did not need to know. I had already learned something important from the first incident. When you start digging into a situation built on assumptions and shortcuts, you often find more than you expected. The city eventually issued additional compliance notices. Nothing dramatic like a movie scene where someone gets dragged away in handcuffs. Real life is usually quieter than that. It was paperwork, meetings, inspections, deadlines, The kind of slow process that frustrates people who are used to getting their way instantly. And I think that was the hardest part for Colin. He was used to moving fast and making decisions before anyone questioned him. Suddenly, he had to explain those decisions to people who were not impressed by his confidence. I saw him one afternoon standing outside his garage while an inspector reviewed his equipment. For the first time since meeting him, he looked less like the expert giving advice and more like someone realizing he had made a mistake. He noticed me watching and walked over. I honestly expected another argument. I expected him to blame me. I expected him to say I had overreacted. Instead, he just stood there quietly for a moment. "You really had to take it this far?" he asked. I remember that question because it told me everything. Not, "I shouldn't have done that." Not, "I'm sorry." His concern was still that I had responded. I looked at him and said, "Colin, I did not take anything anywhere. You installed something on my house without asking. I just stopped pretending that was okay." He did not answer. He just looked away. And that was the closest thing to an apology I ever got. Months passed, and eventually things settled down. The neighborhood went back to normal. People walked their dogs. Kids rode bikes. And everyone went back to worrying about ordinary things instead of whether their neighbor was turning the street into his own private security project. But for me, the experience stayed with me. It changed the way I looked at small moments where people cross boundaries. Because the truth is, most people do not wake up one morning planning to become the villain in someone else's story. They convince themselves they are helping. They convince themselves they know better. They convince themselves the rules are only there for people who need them. And that is where problems begin. The porch light still hangs above my door today. It is not expensive. It is not connected to an app. It does not record anything. It just turns on when I flip the switch. And maybe that is why I like it so much. It does exactly what it is supposed to do. Nothing more and nothing less. It welcomes me home. It lights the walkway. It belongs to me. Looking back, I realized that whole situation was never really about a camera. It was about a person deciding that his version of what was right mattered more than my own choices. It was about the moment someone stopped seeing a neighbor and started seeing a project to fix. And I think that is a lesson a lot of communities need to remember. Safety matters. Technology matters. Looking out for each other matters. But respect matters too. Without respect, even good intentions can become a form of control. So I want to hear what you think. If you came home one day and found that a neighbor had changed something on your property because they believed they were improving your life, would you give them a chance to explain? Or would you immediately draw the line? Do you think Colin was a person trying to help, who simply went too far? Or do you think the moment he touched someone else's property without permission, he crossed a boundary that could not be ignored? Leave your thoughts in the comments because this kind of situation always creates a bigger conversation about where the line is between community support and personal freedom. And if you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who believes that owning a home means more than just paying a mortgage. Sometimes it means protecting the quiet little things that make that place yours. Because in the end, it was never just a porch light. It was a reminder that no matter how advanced technology becomes, no one should ever forget the simple rule that has always mattered. Respect someone else's home.